podcast the other day that didn't get recorded.
No,
It's nice to meet you, Stone.
nice to meet you too, brother. What should I call you? The MA or what?
You can call me Ape, the Modern Ape, whatever sounds good. I mean, whatever you like. It doesn't matter. I'm really happy to have this discussion with you because I've checked out some of the stuff you've been saying online, and I checked out a little bit of the music that you have online. You're the lead singer in your band, is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah, I checked it out, and I was expecting just to see some, crazy, satanic, like crazy metal music, just screaming. And of course, I mean, it's metal. There has to be screaming, right?
Of
But
course.
it was different than what I expected. It had a more of a message than I expected to see there. And there's sort of a subgenre that seems to be here of political metal music. Can you expand on that and talk a little bit about what led you to this point?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, it's not a surprise, to hear that you come with this preconceived notion that there's going to be some satanic approach and some type of overly aggressive message or whatnot to the music. That's definitely an idea a lot of people have that aren't necessarily fans of metal. Um, this, for better or worse, is indefinitely something that the media kind of brings to the forefront. And to be honest, a lot of those types of bands, because I'm not saying that doesn't exist, because it does, but a lot of those bands tend to get the most attention because of shock and awe in a lot of ways. So, bands like Cannibal Corpse or Deicide or things like this, bands that, have that brutal type of message, do get a lot of coverage and attention. But to be truthfully honest, the vast majority of metal is, and kind of always has been, political. We think back to the earliest roots, Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
uh, their song War Pigs is a political song. Generals gather in their masses. It's all about essentially sending the poor off to war, and then while all the those who are rich and are empowered get to sit back and watch all the plebes die, for causes that don't necessarily benefit them. And this is a theme that is carried throughout the years. Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth specifically, even Metallica touched on a lot of politics, especially on the And Justice for All album. So, and that theme is carried on and on for years. One of the bands that I'm a huge fan of, and we get compared to a lot, is Machine Head, and they themselves are very political most of the time, as well as Sepultura. So this is definitely something that's, I think, is very important to call to light for most people when they are interested or maybe dabbling in or would like to understand metal more, is that there's so much more to heavy metal than just hailing Satan or whatever that catchphrase might be. And that's not even to say that there's just the satanic stuff and then politics as well. I mean, there's more subgenres of metal than there are of any other music.
Hmm.
So you have there are metal bands in specific genres that sing about just drinking and partying all the time. There are bands that sing about wizards and warlocks and dragons, and there's so many different variations. It's like books. Do you want fantasy? Do you want politics? Do you want reality? Do you want sci-fi? Like it's all there underneath the metal blanket, if you will. And for us, I think I personally, probably somewhere in my 20s, came to the realization, because I've been doing music for some time, and when you're in your teens, late teens, maybe even early 20s, you're still a very emotional person. You're still very leaning on these ideas of what you're feeling and how things affect you. So there's a lot of songs in my early career that really lean on heartbreak or things like that. But I think once my prefrontal cortex really started to come online and I started to become vastly more educated about the world around me, I began to switch and shift gears over to the area, simply because I really felt to myself that it would be disingenuous to create art and not have that art um, attempt to change the world for a better in some way, shape, or form. And so to speak truth, to speak whether it's my truth or just a universal truth, it, to me, is kind of the most important thing. And I think one of Shakespeare's characters in one of his plays really said it best, that all art is political, anything else is just decoration.
Mm.
And that's, to me, the most important thing there is. Like, that's how I can define true art from my own perspective, of course. For true art from just decorative things, I have art on my walls, and some of it is beautiful and some of it is lovely, but it's really just there for decoration. um, when I look at things that I completely envelop and want to delve into more and look at or watch or listen to more often, those are the things that help change, alter, grow, develop my own perspective of the world. And that, to me, is what art is, and that's what we try to do in Contortion.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that was a great, metal 101 that you gave us. I mean, that was just awesome.
Thank
That
you.
completely just smashed a lot of my ignorance out of the window. So I'm really glad that you took the time to tell us this. Now, seeing as metal has been political for a very long time, I mean, you
Mhm.
talk about Black Sabbath. I mean, that's been there for a while. Like, you can just say that name, and even somebody who knows nothing about metal will be like, "Oh, I've heard of that. I know what that is."
Yes.
So I've heard you the other day, and this is when I really got to figure out, who you are and sort of check your stuff out. You sent a tweet where you were talking about communicating with people on both extremes of the political spectrum, people on both
Hmm.
the left and the right, and you wanted to just communicate with them and see what happens. Where did this idea come from, and what were your goals with doing something like this?
So I had within having a conversation with a friend of mine weeks and weeks ago, we kind of came to the understanding that people aren't having the same conversations about issues. So you take some of the extremes, and for better or worse, in my perspective, in my understanding, a lot of these things aren't the truest um, parameters of what really affects our nation or the world, writ large. But these are always the topics that are at the forefront of these discussions in the left right paradigm. And these are things like abortion, or what to do with school and healthcare, and all of these interesting parameters, when realistically, I mean, war and economics are the top two things that affect our country more than anything, and they're linked to one another inextricably. Like,
Hmm.
they are tied together, and if you stop doing so much war, then the economic thing becomes a lot more open, and we can do more things with more money. But that aside, um, I seem to notice that, let's take the abortion thing, for example. And I don't have much of a dog in this fight. I cannot create life with my own body. But you find that on one end, for the left, they're saying, it's a woman's right to choose because it's her body, etc. And then over here, on the right, they're saying, well, this is murder of a human being. And those aren't the same conversation. You know what I mean? This is one person talking about this person's body, etc. This person's talking about, the potentiality of the life to be. Then we look at situations like universal healthcare. People are saying over here that it should be a right, that it's, people are dying, people can't afford this, et cetera, et cetera. And then over here, people are saying we don't want socialism. That's not, again, it's not the same language. It's not the same discussion. There's a disconnect. People aren't seeing eye to eye.
Mm.
It's like if we went out to dinner and we sit down at a table and we're not even in a particular restaurant that serves food that we're arguing over. I'm saying I want Chinese and you're saying that you want Italian, but we're sitting in like an American style restaurant. We're not having a correct conversation here about the center of what's going on, the meat of the issue. And this is one thing that I'm trying to figure out lately, of like, where is the middle? Where does the discussion truly meet? For the abortion thing, if the left is willing to admit, yes, if you consider abortion murder and we agree that, okay, sure, it's murder, but where does it become murder? And where do we draw the line? If there is a line to be drawn, for some people there may never be, but it's not even so much the discussion of compromise, because that comes after finding the point where people can discuss the exact same discussion. And that's what I've been most interested in, is trying to figure out where that is on a lot of these issues. And I don't know that there is, but I would like to be able to hopefully discover in some of these ways where that line is, or where that middle ground is for everybody to talk about the same thing in the same way. And that's been my goal lately. And I have yet to truly break through. It would seem that some people with the little blue check mark and whatnot, I have gotten some discussions going with some people, but I have hit a few walls and a few roadblocks with some of these folks that, and I don't know if it's because I'm not coming in super, righteous or angry or full of fervor and anger or anything of that nature, but because I come at them rationally and I'm trying to do this thing, they eventually just stop responding to me at some point. And I'm like, okay, I thought we had a discussion going here. I'm trying to find this. And if you're not willing to do this, and that in some ways I'm starting to think that people just really like being angry and really like to just be right all the time. And I'm not trying to affect spontaneous change or an immediate, like this person's going to think the way I think. That's change comes over time. It's nothing happens in the blink of an eye. Everything is going to take time, and so on and so forth. And my input at this point, if there is any, is just to see if there is a way to get to that level, because that's going to be the first step if there ever is one.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with one of the, I really think you hit on an important topic here when you talked about sort of the idea that we have a failure to communicate here in this country. And part of that failure to communicate is caused by the fact that we really are not speaking the same language. And that's not even a metaphor. I mean, we literally are not speaking the same language. When you talk about certain words that we use, we have different definitions on a partisan level of what certain words mean. So when we talk about words, for example, like racism, which is an incredibly charged word, especially considering the history of this nation and where we are right now. The word racism has been given different definitions depending on what institute, what structure, what piece of the political game you're trying to play. So, for example, if you talk to someone in a sociology class, they might tell you that the definition of racism is institutional racism. In other words, that it has to have power as a part of its definition. So it's prejudiced, racial prejudice plus power. They would tell you that that is the definition of racism. And they would equate that to saying, well, since a person of color does not necessarily have any institutional power, then they cannot be racist. Ergo, African American people cannot be racist. And then you would see someone, all the way on the right looking at that and saying, well, hold on just a second. You just changed the definition of the word. This is not the traditional sense of the word that I had, right? But they're not having that conversation. We don't have these conversations. What we do is use the same term, but your head has one definition, my head has another definition. And rather than trying to come to the conclusion of what this certain term means, we just argue about it without really communicating, because it's very possible, and we do this all the time, to argue without actually communicating. And then
Precisely,
on,
and that's
yeah,
to expound on that. I think that it's like as if you and I are talking about painting the house, and I tell you that we should do the master bedroom blue. And blue in your mind could be like a dark blue, navy blue, whatever, midnight blue. And in my head, I'm thinking something a little bit more, lighter colored, whatever, like a sky blue, baby blue, whatnot. But because we don't have that communication, that clarification, again, that middle ground, that like, okay, what does this mean to you? What does this mean to me? And where in the middle do we discover this? Then you end up painting the room while I'm gone. I come back and I'm like, this is an atrocity. This is horrible. This is not what I had in mind, et cetera, et cetera. But this is on a much larger platform, a much more life-changing, social, altering platform and level that most people, I don't think, are completely grasping. And you have a very valid point there that, yeah, if we can find the median definition here and something that we can all agree upon, then we can again start to have that rational conversation and move forward.
yeah, yeah. I think part of the reason why it's just so difficult for us to come to a certain agreement has to do with the fact that we're sort of in a subjective abyss about human behavior. We're in a situation where we're coming to terms with the fact that society has become increasingly secular, which is, as opposed to the society that we had a couple hundred years ago, which had much more of a religious, sort of lifestyle. So as you move away from that, you move away sort of from the religious values. And it's not to say that religious values, were some perfect system. I mean, any number of atrocities occurred due to how sort of thought about the way the Bible should be interpreted, or any other scripture that you can name.
Precisely.
But
Well, yeah, if we look at that, that's it's kind of been a repeat theme, because you look at that exact thing. It's the interpretation of the Bible. Again, it's how people are defining a particular thing. Like, oh, the Bible means this. No, the Bible means that, and then swords are drawn.
yeah,
It's like it's the same. It's a repeat theme through history, and I think I would like to believe that we've come to a level of technology and intelligence, with being able to reflect on history and all these things, that we should be able to, in the next, whether it's a few decades or century or whatnot, come to a point that it's like we can bypass some of this stuff and get rudimentary, ground level footings for having these discussions at some point.
yeah. Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, I think one of the biggest obstacles we have is the fact that we can't really see any sense of objectivity in terms of how we should behave. In other words, we have different ideas about how a person should be morally and in terms of what goals they should have. And right now, since we've moved away from like this universal system, which could be, the Bible, the Quran, or any other, religious, ideology that people would use to just sort of have a universal way of thinking about the world and a universal morality. As you move away from that, people sort of have to create their own way. And in creating their own way, it can prove to be, just an excellent opportunity to recreate the system and formulate something that's absolutely amazing, something that's never been done before. But it can also pave the way towards a catastrophe, because now that we have this opportunity, we also have this responsibility. And how we adjust to this is incredibly important. I really do think that the United States in this moment, and just the world in general, is at a crucial point in time where we're going to decide how it is that we adapt to the changes that are happening so quickly around us, because it's going to become incrementally more difficult for us to adapt to technology, to societies that are more of a melting pot, to a more secular society where there's less religious people, to the combination of a secular society with various different religions, and how we can mix that up at the same time while recognizing that there's different sorts of people that maybe the same morality won't work for everyone. How do we make sense of that? So I think until we really invest a lot of time and energy into solving these sorts of questions, we really are going to stay in this sort of conundrum. And I wonder what role you think, for example, something like psychedelics or just entheogens in general may have on this, or do you think that maybe they have another purpose? Because I've heard you talk about how you have a past history with entheogenic substances, and I'm curious as to what you think about these substances, because to me they're just a complete mystery what these things even are. I mean, it's fascinating that this sort of experience can even exist, but how to make sense of it is something that it seems like you might spend your entire life trying to do. So what do you really think about the psychedelic experience, and how do you think it relates to how humans sort of act on a societal level?
First and foremost, when it comes to the psychedelic ideas and essentially them within our culture, I first and foremost would really like to state openly, I do believe wholeheartedly that psychedelics should be legal across the board. And that's not because I have some like grandiose idea that psychedelics will wake up the world and aliven the spirits of all, and will become united and have this utopian. That's not why I feel that way. I feel that way because from somewhat of a libertarian kind of view, if you will, that as adults, as free thinking, liberal human beings, we should be able to make the choice of what we do and don't put in our bodies. I mean, we let people every single day shove McDonald's and, Burger King and other fast food poisons into their face with no regard, and we don't tell them that they can't do that. And we all know that McDonald's is bad for you. We all know that things like that and cigarettes and so forth cause cancer. Nobody's telling me I can't go buy a pack of cigarettes. I do it every few days. I still get to smoke, but, marijuana, which is finally starting to come into the forefront and starting to become legalized state by state here and there, people are realizing, oh, this is not that bad of a thing. But more to the point, it's if you're truly free, if you live in the quote unquote land of the free, then you as an individual should be able to just put what you want into your mouth and experience what you feel like experiencing. For me, the psychedelics were kind of like at first an experiential / party thing in my teenage years, and this is typically through low doses. Maybe like a hit, maybe 2 hits of acid, something small like that. Just a gram or 2 of mushrooms. Like these are things that aren't gonna, rip open the veil and, reveal like the wall of Vishnu to you or anything like that. Like you're not completely experiencing ego death, as Terence McKenna or people of his stripe would explain to people. But I do feel that once an individual is truly ready in their heart, in their mind, set and setting has a lot to do with this. The Timothy Leary, for all of his faults, explained that much pretty well. That once an individual is truly prepared psychologically for something like this, it will shatter all of your preconceived notions of the world and of your reality. I have experienced this through quite a few different entheogens, and would say that it played a really big role in creating the person that I have become. Whether that be through, and each entheogen kind of has its own story to tell, whether that be through edibles, via THC or psilocybin or even DMT. DMT, fortunately for me, again, this is one of those things where until you hit that heroic dose level, you're not really breaking through the veil. You're not blasting off, if you will, or changing your reality completely. But for me, the very first time I ever experienced DMT, it was exactly like that. I was not in my body. I was not on this planet. I dove deep into space, which at the same time was my own subconscious, and sat at the edge of the deepest, darkest secrets of myself, and what felt like for a long time meditated and pondered on how much I really truly wanted to know the inner secrets that I even hide from myself within my own subconscious. And after a while of meditating on it and standing at that proverbial doorway, I decided, you know what, I can come back here anytime. Today is not the day, but it's good to know that this is here, and I shall return here again some other time. And with that thought, that's when everything started to revert, and within moments I was sober again. And this was all
Wow.
within like a 5-10 minute period. So to have that type of experience, most people, I would venture to guess, most people don't get to delve that deep into their own psyche. You know, one can experience revelations of all sorts. Now, be that through religious text, through philosophical writings, and discussions. I have a book about Nietzsche sitting right here next to my bed that I've begun reading, and I'm super enthralled. I've been kind of a follower of his for a while, but I'm really stoked to get a little bit deeper into some of his writings and so forth. But there doesn't seem to be anything quite like the psychedelic experience. Um, it's a difference between reading the entire text and getting the cliff notes, or as they call it, like a crash course, because there are ways to reach that same level of introspection, of personal reflection. I've had borderline DMT style trips doing hatha yoga. That's a thing. That's written. I'd already done DMT and I've done yoga, but I hadn't done hatha yoga. And I had done hatha yoga like a couple of times, but then there was a specific teacher that I was taking a class from, and through their instruction, through their explanation of how to do the practice properly, I did have a brief moment of like, whoa, that was intense. That was a lot like DMT. And Rogan and many other people explain that you do have DMT within you. Most living things do. Is there a way to tap into that? Is there a way to draw that out? I'm uncertain of that, but I can fully vouch for having done hatha yoga and experiencing something very similar. I also meditate almost every day, and I don't do it for hours on end or anything. I'm working my way up to that. I've only been doing it regularly for the past few months, but I can vouch for the fact that meditation is changing me drastically. And it's one of those things where I specifically work on Zen meditation. Transcendental is kind of one of the most popular ones. But me focusing on Zen meditation, there have been moments where I have reached also a similar level, and touched on it for the briefest moments, to some of the experiences I've had while on LSD or psilocybin. Not with like the visuals, but in the internal feeling and the mental state where my thoughts stray and kind of work on their own, and I'm able to find these connections within things that I didn't necessarily see or notice in like my open, awakened, conscious state. And then once you find that Zen moment, though, it's amazing. It's really, I'm not gonna lie, it's very difficult to get there. That Zen moment is where you're not having thoughts, and that's fucking hard to do. And I'll get it for a brief moment, and admittedly, this is one of the silliest things, but I'll get that for like a second, maybe two, and then my brain goes, fuck yeah, you did it, man. You're really good at this. And I'm like, shut up, dude. Like, we're trying to focus here. Like, stop. You know, my ego just steps in and takes over again. And I'm like, calm down. We're trying to not think thoughts. Stop applauding yourself. We just got here. So there are ways to get there. There are ways for human beings to uh, circumnavigate, you know, and do the long game to get to that introspective level. But I do think that, you know, there is a place for, and there is a reason that psychedelics and entheogens overall can be important for our society. I mean, are you familiar with Sam Harris?
Yeah.
So in his book Waking Up, I can't explain quite how much I related to his description of experiencing MDMA for the first time, ecstasy, because he nails it. He explains it perfectly in the sense that, you know, he's there and he's conversing with one of his friends, and in that moment, you know, he, of course, this is me butchering the way that he describes it, but he says that the love and compassion that he has for that person, for his friend in that moment, is completely beyond anything he's ever felt before for another individual. And that's dead on. Like, there's something to uh these substances that helps us essentially uh, essentially reach plateaus that we think we feel on a regular basis or hope to feel on a regular basis, and you get a taste of something beyond what you are and who you are. And when you walk away from that, it's not like, oh, that was fun, like when you went out the other night, you know, drinking with your friends or whatever. um, it's a completely different experience. And in that, so many things can be understood and learned from. And, you know, I've had moments of doing some of these things with my wife, and the ties and the bonds and the both of us shed of our egos, shed of all our exterior masks, or you know, the things that we put on for the world and the ways that we feel and so forth, and you get down to the rudimentary of who you truly are, and you're sharing that with another person. Like, it's enough to make you weep, man. Like, I'm getting a little bit choked up just talking about it, because having experienced it, there's nothing like it. And I'm not trying to sell this to anybody. I'm just letting the world know, like, this is important stuff. And to give that to people in some way, shape, or form, in a safe, comforting, warm, welcoming environment, can change their lives and
Right.
change your perspective and make you more loving and more compassionate for other people, thereby transcending the things like the left right paradigm and all these stuff that these masks and these walls and these hurdles that we put in front of ourselves and in front of other people to get to us. And it's life changing, undoubtedly. I think I explained what you asked. Sorry, I was a little long winded.
Oh, you definitely explained it. I mean, with flying colors. I'm very glad that you brought up also different, what I consider to be altered states of consciousness. You know, like meditation and yoga. I mean, I don't do yoga, but I do meditate on a regular basis. And you can definitely, you know, get to a certain point in meditation where it just feels like the come up during a small dose of acid when you just have that very clean feeling of euphoria and just, just pure concentration in the moment. And that sensation is just absolutely incredible. But it also comes with a lot of hard work. And then, once you get it, you want to get it again. And that effort is sort of futile. It's like if you chase it, it doesn't come. But if you just, let yourself be, then eventually it comes on its own. And I've always thought that was a great. It's a great disciplinary tool. It teaches you, sort of not to chase an emotional high, but just to let yourself be, and the good things will sort of follow from that. If you just allow yourself to be in the moment, then you can train yourself to have a different sort of way of looking at the world. And so, on top of that, I mean, I really do think that we have sort of a messed up way of looking at psychedelics, because on one hand, you have people who completely just want to get rid of the psychedelic experience, and they think that this stuff is just poison, and they have all sorts of misconceptions. That's, more on the uneducated side of the psychedelic spectrum. And then on the other side, you have people who think that if you give someone a little bit of sunshine acid, that everything is going to be perfect and that you're going to change the world overnight. And obviously, I mean, I think both of those views are completely wrong, because for starters, I mean, the psychedelic experience is not just about the psychedelic, right? I think when you ingest a compound, it's not just the compound, it's who's taking the compound. What is the biology of this person? What are their past experiences? Why are they deciding to take this? What is their what is their setting? What is their dose? And how do they plan to make sense of this experience after it's all said and done, right? So all of those questions I think are extremely important. That's why I really do support the idea of psychedelic research. The fact that we can sort of take these substances and try to make sense of them on a scientific level, and try to also incorporate them in an intelligent way to solve our problems, like mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, things of that nature. I really do think that's the most intelligent approach. And the reason I think that, it's because I think it starts with something like mental health, but I think it can quickly escalate into something else. I think if we can sort of figure out how to make, certain chemicals, especially psychedelic chemicals and theogens, work for depression and anxiety, then we can make them work for couples therapy. Then maybe perhaps we'll figure out a way to make them work for creativity or for any other sort of goal that we might have, right? Maybe it doesn't
Precisely.
work in some forms, right? So we have to take into consideration not just the psychedelic, but what we're doing with it. How are we handling it, and how do we make sense of the world after the trip? I mean, I talk about this often, the idea of, the trip might have been extremely difficult on you. It might have just destroyed your worldview. It might have just put you at zone zero, and now you have to just, sort of make sense of the world again, because all your cultural boundaries have been dissolved, and who you thought you were has been put into question, and now you have to sort of rebuild yourself from scratch. And so how do you do that? Because you have to do it. I mean, you can't just, like, you can't destroy an entire system of thought and then replace it with nothing. You can't be an empty vessel, right? You have to just you get rid of the old culture, but what do you get as new programming? What is your
Right.
programming now?
If you look at your brain or your body as a computer and you wipe out all the software and now you're back down to like just DOS, just a blank screen with a little cursor. Yeah, you have to have something a new zip drive or a new disk to drop in there and reformat and update, Windows per se. You know what I mean? Like your iOS is completely shot out. Your operating system can get stripped down. I mean, you can still talk and you can still walk and you can still function in the world, but yeah, the ideologies eventually do with either a high enough dosage or enough doses over time, you will lose much of your understanding of the world at large or even yourself. And it's I would recommend for anybody who does go down that path and who does those things is keep reading, keep expanding. I mean, again, it's, through the meditation, all these other things, that's the long-term, long game type of experience. And like we were talking earlier, change doesn't typically come at the snap of your fingers, but it can at times, in particular through heavy doses of psychedelics. But if you're the type of person who is looking for change, who is constantly growing and constantly expanding, I read all the time. I listen to podcasts all the time. I'm trying to always elevate and grow, mentally, physically, spiritually, in all these ways. And if a person isn't trying to do that, if you're not always trying to update your own operating system on all levels, then psychedelics probably aren't going to be the best, pool to swim in, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that we don't really have to integrate this stuff once we're done, because there's so many variables that you have to take into consideration. And I'm also a huge fan of philosophical obsession after a psychedelic experience, right? Because of the fact
Hmm.
that, like you said, if you look at it in terms of a computer, although it's not completely like that, but it is in some ways similar, because you everything falls into question. Everything becomes doubted after something like an intense bout with ego death. Um, After that, the process of integration, I see nothing better. I mean, obviously, it depends on what was called into question, right? But a lot of times, what's called into question is things like, the what is the nature of reality? Who are you really? What is your life about? What are you gonna do for the rest of your life? Are you just gonna wait until you die and just work a job that you hate, or are you gonna follow some dream that you have? What are you with your time, and how should you feel about all these doubts? Back then, you may have taken things for granted. You may have thought, well, this is my life and everything is real and this is how it is. And then after that's called into question, it's gonna be something that you doubt probably for the rest of your life. It's not like you're gonna
Hmm.
just into the pool of ignorance that existed before that. No, you're gonna be someone who has to deal with this stuff. And unless it's a depressive disorder or something like that, if you're dealing with sort of an existential crisis, you have to figure out a way to make sense of your morality and the way you behave and what you do, because if you don't, then these ideas are just going to continuously haunt you. And that's why I think that I really don't like talking about psychedelics as though there's some beautiful, awesome thing, because they can be, but they're a double-edged sword, right? It's like you can slice open a watermelon and eat it, but you can also slice your head wide open and end up with a split cranium. And so that's a huge problem, is the fact that we just don't know how it's going to affect any certain individual, and we just don't know enough about this stuff. And so everyone that wants to take a psychedelic, I would ask them, why do you want to do this? What's
Hmm.
your goal here? And do you really think that it's necessary, and do you understand what could possibly go wrong here, and how do you plan to make sense of what happens afterwards? Because you're going to need to do that most likely, unless you just take a little bit of acid, a really small dose of acid, and see some colors, you shit your pants, and you never want to talk to your friends about it again. I mean, that
Right.
can happen too. That there's a lot of, and that's the other thing, is people think that they're going to learn something, right, from the experience. I mean, I can tell you that you can have some absolutely terrifying psychedelic experiences and get absolutely nothing from it other than just an intense bout of fear, right? And that's
Hmm.
happened. I don't think that every time that you're terrified under the influence of a psychedelic, it means that you're learning. It can be, but it can also turn out to just be you feeling horrific. I mean, maybe it was just a bad day and you shouldn't have taken it, right?
Right.
It's a lot of stuff that has to be taken into consideration. Ego death can fuck with you in various ways. So back to the whole idea of morality, because this and today, and we've always had this problem. We just sort of addressed it in a pseudoscientific way. But now that we have the scientific method and a whole different line of reasoning about the world, what do you think we should do to sort of make sense of it? Because I don't think we have an answer about how we should behave as people. And I don't think it's a universal thing. I mean, that's one of the things Nietzsche talks about. He talks about the will to power, right? About how since there's, since morality is subjective, so what are you going to do about that? He says, well, let's focus on what gives, something useful to the individual, what enhances life. And that which enhances life is that which you should do. And that was sort of his sort of idea, right? In a certain way. I mean, that's a little bit far-fetched, but it's more or less where he was coming from. But that whole idea about the will to power comes from acknowledging that morality and human behavior is subjective, that there's no sort of morality that's embedded into the fabric of the universe that's telling us we have to be this certain way. And that's always been true, but we've sort of created structures, defense mechanisms against that, which is, our own systems of morality, religion, and so on and so forth. But as we strip those systems away, we need new systems, just like after a psychedelic trip. It's like our society is collectively, trying to come to grips with its own psychedelic trip. It's like we've tripped and now we have to figure out how to make sense of it. And so I don't know what
that's a good analogy.
So that is.
That's a good analogy.
But I'd like to get your thoughts on more or less, what do you think would be helpful to us in a moment like this?
I think it was great that you brought this up, because as I was listening to your the recent podcast that I had commended you and the other gentleman on, there were some thoughts that had popped up because you had brought up that same thing about Nietzsche. And if I remember correctly, Nietzsche, he originally in his early days of philosophy was a big fan of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer's whole thing was first principle, and his first principle was the will to live. And then Nietzsche kind of built upon that and is like, okay, first principle is survive. But then he's like, well, okay, if you can survive as human beings, what comes after that? And then, as you say, will to power, like what is it that progresses us as human beings to continue to grow or to continue to do the things that we do? And so to kind of bring all of this full circle, let's start with the idea that, in the past, you look at historically, pre-religion, you have essentially the idea of a shaman, somebody who is the wise person of the camp or the group. And in particular, in Central America, South America, parts of North America, and even historically in parts of Europe and India and Africa, even, psychedelics are around the world. They're everywhere. Amanita muscaria in the northern parts of Europe, which is a particular type of psilocybin mushroom. Then you have peyote, also known as mescaline, here in the Northern American region. You have ayahuasca down in South America. You have a plethora of things all throughout Central America, and anywhere where you find, vast amounts of different plant life and so forth in jungles and along the equator. So the human species is not, we're not deaf to the idea of psychedelics. They've been around for a long time. But you had a shaman who was like the experienced one, the one who knew this is the journey, this is what this does, this is what you're going to experience moreover, and I can help you through this. You're going to see your own things, you're going to feel some of your own things, but moreover, this is the blanketed experience, and I'm going to help guide you through this. And afterwards, we're going to discuss what we felt, what we thought, what we experienced. Now, that kind of same blueprint, removing the psychedelics, is a lot what church is like, if you think about it, right? So in the Catholic community, there's a lot of song, there's a lot of preaching. The priest is upon the pulpit and he's explaining in in particular, back in the day, it was all through Latin. So we would read all these verses in Latin and then explain to the people, this is what this means. And then they'll have communion, they eat and drink from Christ, and then they all say their prayers, and then they all go home. General mass. And then so you're having the experience, again, similar to the psychedelics. You're eating Christ, you're drinking Christ, you're hearing this interesting language you don't really speak, and then the shaman in this case explains to you what all this means. And this is what you're experiencing. This is what we're talking about. And then you take this lesson and you go home. Now, fast forward to today. You have the beauty of things like MAPS, which is the what is it, multiple disciplinary for psychedelics. They're essentially scientists that are working on how to modernize and properly understand via science. Thereby, we can legalize these things and explain them appropriately to the masses. This is what these do. This is what this is. And this is how it can be used appropriately for these things. You brought up depression. That's a fucking great place to start. PTSD specifically. We used to have, back to the shaman idea, in those days, there were rituals for war. Dave Grossman actually wrote a book, Lieutenant Dave Grossman wrote a book called On Killing, and he talks about some of these things, in particular, just in the early part of the 20th century, how there was still a little bit of a ritualistic idea of you as a team trained with your friends, you went to war, and then you all came back home from war together. So it was an experiential group set. And then that kind of goes away, and you see PTSD on the rise as we start to kind of separate these things. And now, in NAM, you train with your group, or you fly out, moreover, by yourself, and then you go to war, you serve your 12 to 13 months, and then you typically fly home kind of by yourself. You don't leave and return with the same people that you trained with or that you fought with and all these other things, thereby removing the individual from the group setting. The ritual is lost, and then PTSD gets worse because you don't have people to relate to necessarily. You don't have that ritual any longer of the decompression and the ramping up with the people that you are tied in with the experience. So we have a world full of people experiencing things on an individualistic level, and it continues to become more and more of a bubble, and we lose the connection and the ties between people. And the beauty of entheogens, psychedelics, is that it reaffirms the connections between you and other people. The shamans recognized it, and MAPS, in some ways, in a scientific way, is attempting to do that same thing, is reaffirm, like, this is what this can do for you. It can break down that ego, can strip you down and help you heal. And whether I obviously don't work for MAPS, I don't take their courses, I don't have PTSD, so I obviously can't sign up to take any of their courses to help progress this thing along. But I would venture to guess, on a rudimentary level, in particular because I know one of their key components is MDMA, is that when you strip down yourself and you have this reaffirming feeling of love, this feeling of whether it's self-love or love for other people, one of those things that happens is this reaffirmation that you are connected to others, that you and other people all share a similar relation. No matter how different you are, you're a human being, I'm a human being. You, I'm pretty sure, live on the opposite side of the country from me, but we have a plethora in common. And if I met you in the streets, I would have no ill will towards you because I know you're a human being who has, hopes, dreams, aspirations, and all the same things that I do, maybe in a different variance. But I don't know that I would necessarily have those same types of ideas or thoughts had I not had the experiences that I've had, be it through meditation, yoga, and psychedelics as kind of a grouping. And I think that to move forward And, in a way, again, you were mentioning how some people think you just give everybody acid or mushrooms and everything's going to be okay. And these other people who have obviously never dabbled in any of these things think that it's all poison, it's all bad, and no good person would do anything like this. Again, back to the beginning of our conversation to some degree, the middle ground. Where's the middle? Where does the conversation meet properly? What do we find within these two things that makes the most sense? Well, those people who think that it's all bad can agree that these other things, PTSD, depression, massive anger issues, bad emotions that kind of plague the majority of humanity, this nation in particular, and these other people that think psychedelics can do everything to solve problems, would also agree that these things are bad. Okay, now we have something to agree upon. All these things are bad. Well, check it out. These psychedelics in particular, we can try these out because they've been shown to assist some people. If we figure out in a scientific way, in a mathematical, bureaucratic process, that these can assist if we do it the right way. You can't do it willy-nilly. You can't go off half-cocked. You can't just go to a rave and now all your problems are solved. You know, if we do it the way that the people who think it's all bad want us to do it, then now we start to see this culmination of the process that can hopefully eventually move this country and the world writ large into a direction that really, in more of a bureaucratic, very lockstep kind of way, in some way, uh, reflects the old shamanistic path. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying that it'll come to a day where everybody's, right to man or womanhood is a path through psychedelics. But I'm not one to argue against that because I do think it's important. I do think that a psychedelic experience, in some regards, is really good for a lot of people. If there were a couple of people from Maps and maybe some really cool, interesting people who are more of the philosophical type, all sat in a room with somebody like, I don't know, Donald Trump or
Mm.
Hillary Clinton or some of these other cats that are world leaders that seem to be staunch and very rigid in their belief systems. I mean, you can pick any number of them, and gave them a heroic dose of mushrooms or MDMA or ayahuasca, and then had some of these philosophical conversations with them while on heavy doses of some of these things. I would venture to guess that on the other side of that, that portal, things would start to look a lot different for that individual. You know what I mean? It can become life affirming and life changing. And I do think that we are slowly getting back onto that path. We're getting back into a direction with psychedelics that you might get to see, whether again it's in 10 years, 20 years, a century, that there's a high probability that these things could become um, somewhat of a staple in whether it be American or just overall world societies, that we're able to, I don't know, for instance, this is kind of what I would hope is that, let's say I had a really bad week, like super bad. Let's say it's like a typical country song. My truck broke down, my dog died, my girlfriend left me, and whatever else, a bunch of other crummy things happened. And instead of going to the bar and drinking myself into a stupor, getting in my car and driving home to weep about it, you know, instead I can go to a therapy session where I sit in a room with an experienced psychologist or doctor of some form. In this case, we'll just call them a shaman. And this shaman, we converse for a little while, and they are able to give me whether a low dose of whatever the substance is for my particular ailment that they feel necessary. And then I'm on this substance. We talk through the issues, we talk through the problems, and then I walk out of this thing feeling, knowing, and understanding that it's like, this is part of my life process. Yeah, my girlfriend left, but there are many fish in the sea, or however you want to look at that. And you know what? My truck issues can be fixed if I just put a little elbow grease into fixing the truck, or maybe purchase a new one, or whatever the case is. And you know what? My dog died, but however I need to tie into that, the experience of the love that I had for my dog, and better to have loved than lost and never loved at all, however you want to look at these things. And then I'm able to walk out of that situation, out of this therapy session, feeling, knowing, and being tied back into the world, to my community, and to my own interpersonal relationship with myself in a
Yeah.
much more healthy way than you can today.
Well, I mean, that would be just absolutely great. And I do agree with you that there's sort of a sort of a uprising of a psychedelic community, a revival of psychedelics. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing that happen is out of desperation, really. I mean, sort of our moral systems are completely being challenged. Our society is being changed at a rapid rate. Everybody wants to make sense of things, and society strives to defend itself. And a defense mechanism is using tools, and a psychedelic is a tool that societies have always used to make sense of things and to use as a tool to, sort of empower them to make the changes necessary. And I love that you brought up the idea of the shaman, because I fell in love with that idea after my first bout with ego death. And for me, my shaman was an online shaman. It was Terrence McKenna, and I completely became obsessed with his videos after my first bout with ego death, because I wanted to make sense of the experience, right? And I figured out that I'm not really gonna get any answers, but I really am gonna understand sort of what happened to me, that I took this drug, that I had this sort of experience, that this is pretty much universal, that feeling of interconnectedness is just all over the place during a really intense experience with certain compounds. And on top of that, I mean, this takes me back to the idea of of Nietzsche, and when he was talking about the will to power, because I sort of bullshit myself for a while. I mean, it was very intense and very difficult for me to understand it. I mean, I was a little shit. I was 19. I'm still a little shit. I'm 24 now. And so at that time, for me to make sense of something like this, it was absolutely, devastating for me. So what I did was I sort of, upheld a bunch of bullshit for a while. I began to support ideas that I knew I had no evidence for, and I sort of lied to myself. And this sort of brings me back to the will to power, because especially in books like Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche goes into the sort of the idea that we don't really want truth. That's not really what humans want. That's not the major drive that leads us to do things. What we want is that which is empowering, right? So we're willing to lie to ourselves with religions. We're willing to lie to ourselves with certain ideologies if they allow us, if they empower us to move in a certain direction. Right now, society has sort of thrown away, a whole bunch of ideas that it had in the past, and now it's sort of looking to replace them with new ones. Do you think that it's sensible to sort of uphold ideas that are false because they're empowering, or are you against that? And do you think we should strive more to make sort of reality empower us instead? So, what do you think about that?
I think that I like the approach of, are you a fan of, or have you read anything by Jordan Peterson?
Yeah.
So in his latest book, um, he does bring up some biblical teachings, and I appreciate his approach to it. I don't completely agree with everything Peterson writes or talks about, but I would have to say I understand and agree with a lot of it. And
And
you
Peterson
know, it,
heavily influenced by Nietzsche.
yes, he is. He is. He quotes him and Carl Jung quite a bit, and I'm a big fan of Carl Jung. Um, but the thing that I can appreciate about Peterson is how he kind of takes a new approach, or a modern approach, if you will, to the religious idea. And insofar that it's like, these are parables and lessons and things that have been taught and passed down through the ages, that you can still draw things from today. But it's it's when you take things too literally in anything. You brought up objectivity earlier, and that's fucking really important for people to understand, is that most things are subjective. It's, how does it relate to you? How does it relate to your life? And you know moreover, you got to understand that it doesn't necessarily relate to everybody in the exact same way. Um, and I feel that, moreover, if we are looking to, and we're already down this path, we are tearing down the structures that got us to the place that we're at now. And people are looking to, as you said, replace them with new teachings and new understandings and so forth. Um, if we are all, in our minds, understanding the difference between objectivity, subjectivity, and more importantly, just nuance, set and setting for situations, and the the topics that people are discussing, and understanding that everybody's kind of coming from a different place. If those become paramount, if those become, the first and foremost thing that everybody's approaching a situation with, then communication can become easier, and can become um, something where we're able to actually have open discussion, where we can find an end through those means. An example of this is, Carl Jung infamized the Myers-Briggs test. And the
Mm-hmm.
moment I understand somebody else's Myers-Briggs, I can relate to them a little bit more, and understand that it's, because I'm an ENTJ, if you understand the Myers-Briggs test, and what those definitions are.
Mm-hmm.
Extrovert, intuitive
Extrovert,
thinking,
yep.
judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
So because I'm an NT, intuitive thinker, my wife is an NF. And so we don't typically speak the same language on a lot of things. She comes from a place of emotion, so how does a situation affect her, or how does she think about it emotionally? Whereas for me, I try to get down to brass tacks. What's the best solution? What are the nuts and bolts, or the numbers and the figures for the thing? But
Mm-hmm.
knowing between us that our subjectivity versus objectivity, they're going to be different. And they're going to be experiential to the individual, and we approach it differently. And thereby, when we have an issue, when we have a problem, reminding myself that this is how she's going to be talking about it, this is how she's going to be approaching the situation, and then her likewise also recognizing that this is my approach, this is my understanding of it. Again, we find the middle ground. Okay, you're coming at it, I can recognize your emotional attachment to this and approach to this, and you can understand that this is why I'm trying to find a solution to this, and
Mm-hmm.
why I seem indifferent to it. It's not because I lack emotions. It's not because I don't feel sad or upset or angry or whatever about this particular instance. It's just because this is how my brain works. This is
Right.
how I operate. And so with that, we can find a common thread, which is super important. And I think, moreover, that's going to be, whether you want to look at it as a philosophical or a psychological approach to the future in communications, I think things like that will end up becoming, of course, if we use them and we integrate them into our societal norms. if
Mm-hmm.
we're if we're looking at these types of things as how to break down the walls of communication, then we can start to get somewhere. because yeah, the religion only got us so far, and now it's starting to fade out, and it's starting to hold
Right.
less and less purpose.
Right.
Especially when people understand it historically and understand it, that not everybody's spiritual information is going to align in a lot of ways. Um, so when we get down to um, both the numbers and then the philosophical slash psychological approach to it, I think within the combination of these two things, we're going to see a new evolution in the human communication level and human evolution
Yeah.
overall.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
That just got things. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was sorry. I had a something in my throat which cut me off. But no, that's all I had to say about that
Oh,
currently.
okay. Well, I'm really. I mean, that's really interesting that you brought up sort of Jordan Peterson's ideology on the Bible, because the I mean, for people that don't know, I mean, the approach he takes is sort of a Jungian, analytical psychology approach to the Bible. And so he sort of looks at it as if these stories are stories from humanity's collective unconscious, like archetypal stories from humanity's collective unconscious. And he sort of makes sense of it like that. It's an approach that I had never heard of, before I met with him. And he sort of does this. The reasons he has for this are, that's why I say he's so inspired by Nietzsche, because of the fact that he's really bringing forward the same fear that Nietzsche had. Nietzsche had the fear that, okay, God is dead, we have killed him, right? Which is to say, okay, now we've destroyed these, old ideologies that have, held the fabric of society together for thousands of years. And so what will you do now that you have decided to kill God? What will you replace God with? Will you become God now? What is the replacement here? And so I see what Peterson is doing is as sort of a defense mechanism to that. I don't know that it'll be a very effective defense mechanism. And I don't think that the idea that these are, archetypal stories from humanity's collective unconscious is going to hold up either, because of the fact, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, the idea that the Bible can be interpreted in a million ways. And, even in analytical psychology, for example, which is the system of psychoanalysis that Carl Jung made up, I mean, you can just take any sort of approach to the unconscious, and your guess is as good as mine. I mean, it could be sex symbols, it could be, whatever Jung was talking about. They could be archetypes, it could be, the mother, it could be, all sorts of different archetypal stories. You could maybe say that that's what's going on, but your guess is as good as mine. And sort of the interpretation of a book that has been reinterpreted time and time again is just so unlikely to yield any fruits. And so the idea is this: who gets to interpret a text and say that they've done so correctly when you live in a subjective world, the world that you were just acknowledging exists right now? I mean, if you and your wife sat down together and, read the Bible page by page and then wrote down sort of a summary, it's very likely that your summaries would look completely different. And you can
Exactly.
say that for any group of people, you would just get completely different understandings of the same groups of words, right? So I really do feel like we are living in a time where we are sort of struggling to cope with the subjectivity of the life that we live in. And with acknowledging that there's sort of the pain that we don't really have an answer to that, and we really got to create one. And that's what Nietzsche was trying to do. And well, we all know how he ended up. I mean, he ended up mad. Now that I believe was probably more due to certain biological factors than anything else, because his father was also a very sick man. But he really was pushing himself to the limit. Nietzsche was a guy who would lock himself up in a room. He would dance. He has a famous quote saying that if you, summarizing here, if you, spent one day without dancing, then that day is wasted, or something along those lines. So his neighbors, the people who would give him the room that he was in, they would complain about the noise that he was making. He would be screaming just all the time. And then he became even more and more erratic. And of course, Nietzsche, it's well known that he was, taking substances. He
Mhm.
was taking some drugs, right? And so that could have contributed to his condition. And so he would start to talk about himself, or mention himself in letters that he would send to other people. He would call himself the Antichrist, things of that nature. Which is, I mean, he has a book where he calls himself the Antichrist, which was, for better or worse, my introduction to Nietzsche. So I mean, when you think about these sorts of things, you can really become obsessed with it, and that can really do you in if you're, obsessing about sort of the existentialist sort of line of thinking, and that can really, really do a number on people, because existentialism is really a big pull of subjectivity, and it's one that hits right at the core of human nature. I really do think it's the most human part of philosophy, even more than metaphysics, or any other ethics, anything else. Because existentialism hits at the core of who we are and what we do. And
Right.
I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you. I really want to see if you have, any other comments or anything that you think that we didn't get to talk about, and for you to really explain, what it is that you do, what your goals are, and just any message that you want to give to anyone that's watching this.
Absolutely. I would have to say the the most important point that I've come to in my life right now is the I guess the figurehead, or the, what's the word I'm looking for? The river, the primary river that feeds all of the lands of these ideas that we're discussing right now
Mm-hmm.
is art. Now,
Mm,
be it, music, be it paintings, sculptures, be it the modern day art, podcasting, I would argue in a lot of ways is its own art form. Um, books, writings of all sorts. I believe in my heart of hearts that religious texts themselves are their own form of art. Um, art is the steering wheel of social norms and social change, and this can be vastly nailed down to many circumstances. If we look at, just briefly, the invention of the printing press. Okay, so you have Gutenberg invents the printing press, and what was it? It was like 1450 or something like that, right?
mm,
Um, and up to that point, books were not ubiquitous. But then the printing press becomes infamized. People are starting to use it more often. It's, now you have pamphlets and you have drawings and things like that that are spread around all throughout Europe. What ends up happening is full blown chaos for a minute, especially once somebody like Martin Luther gets his hands on it in, it was like the early 1500s, like 2015, 17, something like that. Um, and then, you know you create the schism, you create a divide in the church, and it's through the art of the Bible and being able to distribute this art to the masses in a language that they can read. um, and then you further these ideas down the line. Okay, so now we come into things like plays in particular, became a very fervent way to describe ideas and things through art. An interesting example of this, and I think Shakespeare himself kind of fomented this idea, maybe not in my mind, but within his own piece. So you think back to the story of Hamlet, right? So in Hamlet, the people of in the story create their own play. It's a traveling, minstrel group or whatnot, and they create a play, and they alter the play to mimic the circumstances that are going on within the castle. And within the play, it shows the guy poisoning the king, and then the new king is like, "That's not how I did it." And so right there, they through art immediately changed their surroundings, and now the new king who killed the old king, Hamlet's father, is outed, and then all hell breaks loose, etc. So Shakespeare, right there, within his own art, shows how art can change your surroundings. Um, but fast forward to the 20th century, and or even the late 19th century, and you look at how artists, writers in particular, um, were able to foment and create a lot of uprising for things like aiming towards women's suffrage.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, you get the civil rights movement, and then music becomes a huge influence in the 60s, with the anti-war movements and things of that nature. It continues to unfold. Even Picasso himself had painted, what was it, The Massacre, which was kind of a spit in the eye to the military, who had massacred a ton of people. I want to say it was like in Spain or something like that. um, it's a repeat event that we see art being at the steering wheel and helping um, shift the ideas of the masses, because it becomes something that's not overly intellectual and something that everybody can understand and chew and swallow and take home with them and be like, I saw this thing, this is what it means, this is what's going on. A perfect example of this is um, what really truly kicked off the ideas that would eventually spark the French Revolution. So prior to even America earning their own independence from England, you had a play called The Marriage of Figaro, which highlighted in France the tiered system that they had, and was a stark stab at the aristocracy. And um, it seriously fired up a lot of indignation within the people, and was banned through not just France, but the vast majority of Europe, because the ruling elite didn't want this getting into the hands of the people. Mozart himself was even banned from doing the opera that he ended up making based on this play, because it seriously pissed a lot of people off. And then a couple decades later would be, that seeded the idea. And as that plant grew, you combine that with people like Thomas Paine in America. Again, you see this pamphlet using, you see, Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, that being utilized in the States, fomenting dissent in the States, thereby earning them their revolution. Those same people go over to France, where that's already bubbling over, and they use the same type of implements through their writings, through their art, to continue, growing this plant of revolution. And then right there you get the French Revolution almost immediately after the American Revolution. And so I I think it's incumbent upon any individual who truly feels that they like they want something more than just, let's call it, the quote unquote American dream, to own a home, raise a family, and go through the just the basic, run of the mill type of lifestyle. If you want to change the world, if you want to affect your surroundings, the most important thing you do is contribute art in some form of another. And counterwise, I also believe that it is incumbent upon artists to do something more than just, and I lean heavily on like some of these mumble rappers these days that I just can't take it, man. I can't. It's they're not saying anything. They're not contributing anything. It's like the candy or the fast food of art. It's garbage for your mind, for your body, for your spiritual and intellectual growth. If anything, I would argue that it stunts it, because it's not pushing the envelope. It's not contributing to society in any important way to help us all evolve. I do believe that it's incumbent on artists to do something a little bit more, whether that's through unity, whether that's through helping people, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And that's why we do what we do and will continue to do what we do in Contortion. And I fully support any and all other artists of all stripes, you included with your podcast, painters who have something to say and something to show, sculptors, dancers, all these people that can do and create more for the world. That's what I find is most important, and that's what I think becomes the common thread through all of these ideas that we've discussed and then some, that can be the catalyst, or the powder keg and the fuse and the fire to kick things off and push everything into a new direction. Because anybody and everybody can sit down and, like you were saying, read all these philosophies and try to decipher which one's right, which one's wrong. But once we get the artists to help culminate these ideas and help push new philosophies and new ideas and so forth, I think what ends up happening is kind of a self-leveling effect, moreover. And again, we find that middle ground. You combine a little bit of Nietzsche with a little bit of Jordan Peterson, with a little bit of Sam Harris and some Joe Rogan, and then, uh, Schopenhauer, and then maybe throw in some Albert Camus into the mix, like all
Mm.
these different ideas. And then you kind of find that common thread, that medium ground, that thing that combines all of these things, just like in religion, the golden rule. They're all saying the same thing through a different medium, through a different story, through a different individual. But there is a general, message, which is be good to people. The golden rule from the Bible, we all know, is, treat others as you would want to be treated. You can stretch that a little bit further and be like, well, what, should a masochist cause harm on other people? Maybe that's not a good idea. But moreover, people want to be treated with respect. In Buddhism, they say, treat everybody as if they're the Buddha, because they may and probably hold information and wisdom that you don't have yet. And so if you treat them with respect and as if they have something to offer you, then you will eventually gain what they do have to offer, and then they shall in return. And so, yeah, I think there can be a self-leveling, but a lot of this is going to have to and probably will filter through, as it always does, through art.
That was beautiful. That statement you made about art and how it really just is the main tool behind human progress. I mean, it's directly connected to how we use creativity. The expression of human creativity and human potential is art. And I think we sort of think of paintings and, maybe even just songs and sort of limit our idea of what the definition of art is. But I think art really is, you know, just what human creativity does. I mean, to me, that is what art is, and I'd love to see, your ideas on art as they sort of change through time, or maybe even encompass or become connected to other ideas, and what really you end up doing. Please give us some information about where we can check out, Stone's band, which is
Contortion.
Contortion. So tell us, where can we check you out?
We're on Facebook at Contortion the Band. Twitter is Contortion Official. Instagram, I'm pretty sure, is Contortion Music. And of course, we're on Spotify. We're on iTunes. Our last album, which came out a couple years ago, is entitled False Flag Paradigm. We're not complete conspiracy theorists, but we're not, averse
Mm-hmm.
to dabbling in conspiracies. And there is a time and place for them, and to believe that people don't conspire is completely and totally ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so, and we're currently right now, we are both working on a new album with some of the new members that are in the band. We're writing new music. It's going to be phenomenal. We're already working on looking to get a new record label, so that should be a lot of fun. And we're actually we're going on tour in just 2 weeks.
Mm.
So the tour kicks off in at the end of August on the 30th, and we'll be traveling all through California, parts of Oregon, Nevada, and then probably come October we'll be doing some more shows eastbound of California. So we'll be doing like Arizona and maybe some more shows in like Las Vegas area and things like that.
All right. Well, I had a great time. I think we really got some awesome dialogue going on here, and I think we talked about a lot of ideas that really do need to be talked about and do need to be expressed. I really want to thank you, Stone, for coming on here. I had a great time.
Likewise, my friend. I'm super excited. Like I said, via our messages and Twitter conversations. That's when I listened to your guys' podcast, I was like, wow, this is beautiful. To know that more people are having intellectual conversations and more people are dabbling in these ideas and studying, not just ancient, modern texts combined, but again, trying to find that common thread through all of these things and doing what I'm doing or attempting to do anyway, which is, find the middle ground, find topics of that become the seeds that sow the ties that bond us all. And that's, I think it's beautiful what you're doing. And I greatly appreciate you having me on, sincerely, in all rights. And we will be in touch for sure in the future.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure, Stone. It was great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my friend. You have a fantastic weekend, and we'll be in touch.
You too. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.